Hello, my name's Tom Walker. Welcome to That'll Be the Day. In this podcast, I'm going to be talking to a blind man who has enjoyed considerable success in campaigning for better accessibility for visually impaired people in Scotland and further afield. But before we hear from Sandy Taylor, if you like the music at the start of this podcast, it's a track called That'll Be the Day by the Liverpool band The Vow. And as always, at the end of my podcasts, I'll be playing a track by the band. To find out which one it is, stay tuned. Now, a few days ago, I met Sandy Taylor in Glasgow just before the end of the COP26 event. As part of his campaigning work for the National Federation of the Blind, Sandy had been spending the week being filmed to highlight the difficulties for visually impaired people of new cycling schemes in the centre of Glasgow. During our chat, I spoke to Sandy about this, but I was also interested to hear about his life more generally, from being fully sighted right the way through to coping as a blind person. His story is fascinating. This probably has to be the poshest place I've ever recorded an interview. We're in the Hilton Hotel, no less. And with me is Sandy Taylor, who's the outgoing member of the National Executive of the National Federation of the Blind UK. Sandy, here we are in Glasgow, towards the end of COP26. How's the city been for you during the past, 8 or 9 days?
Well, it's mainly been this week, Tom, that we've come in to Glasgow, and we had a number of interviews with councillors. On Monday we met a councillor from the Scottish National Party. On Tuesday we met a number of Conservative councillors. Yesterday we met a couple of councillors from the Greens, and we also met some other people along the way.
And has the city been quite congested?
It's been surprisingly quiet, I have to say. On Monday, George Square was very, very busy, but that was because a strike of bin men was ended, and they were all there balloting, etc. But the town itself, I think people have really been told to keep away, or they think it's going to be congested, and they're staying away.
And because people have been told to keep away, they have done, but you're involved in a lot of campaigning that's keeping you away from the city. Tell me a bit about that.
Well, we met with these councillors to discuss what they're planning to do in Glasgow, particularly with cycle lanes. Now, they're putting infrastructure in place all over Glasgow city centre, which is fine for some cyclists, but I'm afraid it impacts negatively on many other people, particularly blind and other disabled people.
And what's your role been in that? I mean, you've had quite a prominent role, haven't you?
Well, I chair the National Federation of the Blind Scottish branch, and we have a number of members, obviously. And we have campaigned from the beginning, really, trying to stop a scheme in Sauchiehall Street in Glasgow, a very famous street in Glasgow, where they decided to put in a two-way cycle lane. But I'm afraid the cycle lane is sandwiched between the pavement and a two-way cycle lane between the pavement and the bus stop.
What successes have you had with your campaigning?
Well, sadly, nobody is really listening at the moment, and that's why we've been campaigning again, talking to councillors, and we've got a lot of support. But they think this is the only green way to go, is to promote cycling, which is fine, but there's a heck of a lot of other people who want to walk safely, and we want to access public transport, and that's the biggest problem with this two-way cycle lane that we have to cross. We are not going to play Russian roulette with cyclists, so we're not going to use public transport.
Sandy, if you don't mind, what I'd like to do now is go back to your early life. In 1991, at the age of 42, you were diagnosed with retinitis pigmentosa. But before that diagnosis, tell me about your life. What were you up to?
Well, I was born in a little town up north called Forres. And when I was about 15, my parents moved down to the Glasgow area, and I started my first job in Halfords as a trainee in the middle of Glasgow. I worked with them for in total around 21 years. and I started my own business in 1985, a car parts, car accessory shop.
It's fair to say you were a bit of a car head, weren't you, really?
I was a bit of a petrol head, Tom, yes. I rebuilt cars, putting big engines in small cars and all that sort of thing. Not exactly very environmentally friendly these days, but yes, I could fix cars, and I enjoyed doing that. Yeah.
Did you learn those skills at Halfords?
Not really. I learned them basically because I had to. I couldn't have afforded to run a car if I couldn't fix it, and I spent most weekends in the scrap yards and whatever, getting bits and pieces parts. But it stood me in very good stead in starting my own business, because I was more parts orientated than Halfords were at that time.
What sort of driver were you?
Well, probably too fast, if the truth be known.
And when you were diagnosed with retinitis pigmentosa in 1991, you were able to continue driving for quite a while.
Yes, I was. I see, my business, I started with one shop, and with the help of my wife and son, who was only 10 years old when I opened my first shop, but they were very supportive and helpful, and we ended up with 10 shops throughout Scotland. So yes, I could still drive and deliver all the goods around my shops and visit them all on a daily basis.
Before your diagnosis, did you know anything about visual impairment? Was it anything that had ever crossed your mind?
No, but it's probably the one sense that I probably dreaded losing. I think that's the case for most people. Sight loss is a pretty serious situation.
So you had contemplated it in a kind of, how would you best describe this, in a kind of sort of lazy, idle way that we all contemplate things?
Well, I started off really driving with my wife sitting in the passenger seat, and she would wince on occasions when she thought I was going to hit a pavement curb. And it started off with the night driving, you know, that I wasn't very good at night driving, so I had to stop night driving.
And your wife, as you said, was wincing there about the occasional close shave with the curb.
Yeah, I wasn't aware that I was that close to the curb, but she could see it. So that was really the first signs that I had a problem.
And did you think at that stage, this is RP, this is a sight issue, or did you just think I've been a bit careless?
Yes, I thought I was being a bit careless, but as time went on, I thought I better go and get this checked out, and that's when I was diagnosed.
So you drove for 7 years until 1998. How did you eventually decide to give up driving?
Well, I thought I should do it while it was still my idea, and obviously I didn't want to cause harm to anyone else. I had a few bumps on my own car. Thankfully, no one was injured, but I knew it was time to stop.
And stop you did. How did you feel when you did stop? What were the thoughts going through your mind?
I was very fortunate in that my wife drove me around everywhere, you know, so the loss wasn't as bad as I expected it to be quite honest. I was still building up cars for my son. I had enough sight to do that. I still had enough sight to go sailing.
I was going to ask you about sailing, because one of the things you did once you'd given up driving was you went sailing for a couple of years, didn't you?
Well, yes, I had a boat which we kept in Largs on the Clyde, and when I sold my business, I thought I had a few years of sailing the west coast of Scotland, which is a fantastic sailing area. But the weather was so bad that we, with my wife's support, we sailed to Spain. I lived on the boat in Spain for a number of years.
Was sailing a bit safer than driving from your perspective?
Yes, initially, but again, like driving, I knew I had to give it up. You know, it was becoming a bit of a problem as well.
As you kind of progressed through RP and your sight started to deteriorate, what were you doing? What adjustments were you making in your life?
I was very fortunate that my wife would lead me around, and I used to joke that she's getting very good at leading me around. She even tells me when we come to steps, and if she's in a really good mood, she'll tell me whether they go up or down.
And so that helped you, obviously.
Yes, I relied almost totally on my wife to get around, but I maintained our boat, doing all sorts of repair work and servicing just to keep it in good condition.
Did you reach a stage where you had to stop doing that because of you losing your sight?
Well, it really came to a crunch, Tom, when sadly my wife took ill, and she was diagnosed with cancer, and we had to come home, and I sold the boat eventually. But sadly, 2 years later, I lost my wife.
To what extent, Sandy, did you need sight to be able to maintain cars and maintain the boat?
Oh, it's absolutely vital, yes, but I was amazed at what I could actually do while partially sighted. You know, I had a headlamp that I used to see a little bit better, but I know I serviced the engines and the boat and did all sorts of things. And I think you can adapt to do all sorts of things. I mean, now, even totally blind, I have just built a second greenhouse, for instance. I've shelled it all out inside. I've found ways of getting round things, like obviously I can't see a measuring tape, but I cut pieces of wood to the correct length, and then I could use a hacksaw to cut angle aluminium, and I could drill it and bolt it together and so on. And you get a good sense of achievement being able to do these things when nobody really expects you to be able to do it. So I now grow tomatoes and flowers, plants and all sorts of things.
Sandy, how independently then are you able to live now that you are totally blind?
Well, I am fairly independent. I'm fortunate I have a lady friend. She was my cleaner, but she's more than a cleaner now. She does everything for me. She makes sure I've got clean shirts to go to my meetings, that my house is clean. She helps me in the garden, you know, but I try to be as independent as I can. I go out a lot for meals, but I can heat things up and so on. So, and I say I can do a fair bit of gardening. So I'm fairly independent.
And your son lives fairly nearby, doesn't he?
He does, and my son and grandsons are a big help to me in many, many ways, in gardening and concreting and all sorts of things.
Because they helped you with the greenhouse, did they? Or was that your son?
Yeah, my son helped me, yeah. We put in the concrete base, and then I did most of the rest of it, yeah.
What are the expectations of visually impaired people these days, Sandy, do you think?
I think we are pitied in some respects. They don't expect you to achieve many of the things I have been fortunate enough to achieve.
What has surprised you since you lost your sight about the way society views visually impaired people and disabled people more generally?
Well, see, they make things very difficult for us sometimes. With, you know, shared space, we've had to put up with shared space, cycling lanes, a great many different hazards that are put in front of us. And obviously during the lockdown and so on, we had real problems in getting out and about. Social distancing was a real problem because people can see us, but we can't see them.
And what have you learnt about yourself since you lost your sight? When you reflect on how your life has changed, what have you learnt about yourself that maybe would have surprised you when you were fully sighted?
Oh, I think what I have achieved independently, I surprise myself, but I get, a big sense of achievement about being able to do different things. I learned new computer skills, for instance. I can do emails, and I spend a great deal of time. I chair 2 different groups of visually impaired people. I go campaigning. I stood for council 5 years ago. There is no real limit to what you can achieve if you really set your mind to it, and obviously I need it, and I'm grateful for help along the way.
When you look at your life now and think about the fully sighted Sandy before 1991, would you have imagined that a totally blind person like you could be doing many of the things you're doing now?
Oh, absolutely not. I never really thought about it then, about being blind, but I achieved, I think, a lot in my sighted days. But what I've achieved as a blind person, is much, much greater.
Go into a bit more detail for me. You've told me about some of the things you do. Are there any kind of bigger things that you've achieved, maybe psychologically, that you think, I'd have never thought I could have done that?
Probably standing for council was one of them. Never in my wildest dreams did I think I could do that, but because of campaigning and what the local council were imposing on the local community, someone had to stand up for it. I started a petition. I got 3,500 signatures. The council wouldn't listen, so I took it to the Scottish Parliament. I have stood up in the Scottish Parliament. I have sat on committees. And as a result of my petition, we now have a working group of which I'm a member of, which is looking into inclusive design, and that is very, very important.
You've shown a lot of psychological resilience since you lost your sight. Where do you think that comes from, that resilience?
I think my mother's always said I was very determined. All through my life I've been very, very determined. And I think when you're blind, you're campaigning and so on, you've got to have this determination. It's far too easy just to give up when things get a wee bit difficult. So determination is a real factor.
Can you understand, though, why other visually impaired people may step aside and think, well, perhaps I shouldn't get involved in these things?
I can understand that, absolutely. I mean, it's not easy, we're not trying to say it's easy, but I think you get inspired by different people. And I admire much of what you do, Tom. That has inspired me also. But I hope I can inspire people also.
What needs to happen then, Sandy, to improve the lives of blind and partially sighted people, not just here in Scotland, but in the UK more generally? What do we need to look at?
Well, society has a duty to consult with disabled people. So many things are imposed upon us without us. We have a saying, nothing about us without us, but yet so many decisions are taken without consultation with disabled people.
Now, you're standing down from the executive of NFB UK. What are you going to do once you step down, once you've retired? Are you going to build more greenhouses, grow more tomatoes?
Well, I haven't totally given up the thought of standing for council again, and the elections are next May. Things haven't improved in my local area. Somebody has got to do something for the local community. I hear so many complaints about all sorts of things that the council aren't doing, and I think I can do something for the community.
So you are thinking of standing for council again, are you? Because what we need to tell people is that you nearly won a seat on, is it East Dunbartonshire Council? You came 6 votes short?
I did indeed. I stood against the council leader, who was the main person who was putting forward a shared space scheme. So I managed to defeat her, and as you say, I missed out by 6 votes.
So close.
Yeah, for an independent, I was standing as an independent.
Oh, just 6 votes, so close.
Yes, very close.
And you've seen the leader who you actually ousted. She was standing in your ward. How's she reacted to you since her defeat?
Well, for obvious reasons, I don't see much of her, but she's now involved with the community council. And we will cross swords again many times in the future, I'm sure.
I mean, one of the issues that we've talked about periodically during this conversation is access and the shared spaces scheme. Do you think there's any prospect of councillors and planners fully appreciating the extent to which these are really difficult and dangerous for blind and partially sighted people?
Well, we've got to keep trying to impress upon them that it really is in breach of our human rights. This in Canada, they stood up against bus stop bypasses, which is really what I was talking about, where we have to cross a cycle lane to get to and from a bus. So in Canada, it was ruled that it was against their equality and human rights, and I maintain it's exactly the same here. So I've been in touch with the Equality and Human Rights Commission, and I'm hoping that they will take up my case.
I'm going to be a bit indulgent and ask you about e-scooters, which is one of the issues I've been involved in campaigning against. Do you have any thoughts on them?
Absolutely, I share your concerns, and in the National Federation of the Blind, we want them to be banned. There is no half measures here. They've got to be banned. The design of them, inherent design, is wrong. They're used more as toys for youngsters than a means of transport. But it's so hard to regulate them. They're on pavements. They're on footpaths. They're causing havoc to particularly elderly and disabled people.
Moving away from streets and street access, shared services and all that kind of thing, are there any other issues that you think blind and partially sighted people should be focusing on over the next year or two?
Well, I would like to learn some more technology and so on. It's very difficult to get access to it, and I need to learn a lot more myself, and I would like to help my members to get access to technology. I know you're very good on using some of these measures for mobility, etc. I can't do that at the moment, and I really do need to learn.
And what about the National Federation more generally? You're stepping down from the executive, as we've said. What do you think the future is for that organisation?
Well, I'm stepping down now, but there's elections every year, and I give someone else an opportunity to sit on the Executive Council. Who knows? I might try it again next year for that, but there is a limit to what I can do. I can't do everything. So I've stood down now. I might go to the council elections. The Federation, we're very fortunate to have a campaign coordinator in Sarah Gayton, who is vociferous in her campaigning. She is brilliant. So as long as we can keep someone like Sarah, we can continue to go forward.
And as you reflect on your time at NFB UK, any major successes that you're really pleased with?
Well, I got, I think, a lot of people involved in campaigning. We had a good rapport with a number of members. I took over West of Scotland branch in January of this year as it was facing closure. So we've managed to keep it running, and I'm hoping that we have someone else to step up to the chair of that in the new year.
And in the meantime, for you, more time in your greenhouse?
Well, let's hope so. Spring is not all that far away, and it gets me away from my computer for a little time.
Sandy, thanks very much indeed. That's been really interesting. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom.
Well, I hope you enjoyed listening to Sandy's story as much as I did. I thoroughly enjoyed my day with him in Glasgow. And now time for the music. The track I've chosen by The Vow is one called Boys in Their Games.
Chemical haze, lights in the sky. Something's making the rabbits cry. The ladder to fame, boys in the games, and I don't know why. Don't know why. Payday for the ones who dare. Strange ways of the entrepreneur. Choke in the smoke, a sting in the eye, burning the wings of a butterfly, fanning the flames, boys in the games, and I don't know why, don't know to my